I'm Jenny Peterson. I'm president of the Riley County Genealogical Society, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. She may look kind of familiar to you because over the course of this year, she was our presenter 2 other times. She gave us programs in both March and July, but as a historian, I think she doesn't mind talking about history and researching things. And okay, Allana Parker is our speaker today. She not only has been here before, but she's looks a little different this time. Her pregnancy is showing a little more, so she's about to accept another daughter into her life, so that will be great. She's originally from Augusta, Kansas, and she received her BS in history along with a minor in leadership studies from K-State, has her master's in museum studies from the University of Kansas. She served as Curator of Design at the Riley County Historical Museum for 10 years and currently serves as treasurer of the Kansas Museums Association and a member of the Kansas State Historical Society Foundation Board. She served on the committee for this Walking Through History on the Linear Trails project that has been our Genealogy Society big project this year. And she's the graphic artist that designed all those pull-up panels back there, as well as the panels themselves that are being installed around town. So we have a great love affair with Allana and her talents. Thank her so much for being a part of this. She designed the brochure, and she's also the graphic, I guess I've said all that without reading what's written here, but basically the designer for the historical markers as well. Her program today is, as you can tell, the Underground Railroad in Riley County. And with that introduction, I will let Allana tell us more about this than I could ever think to say on my own. So thank you.
I first wanted to start out, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak again today. We have such an incredible history here in Riley County. Any chance to hear stories? I know you are all researchers and interested in history. Anytime there's an opportunity to share those stories is a wonderful time in my book. So thank you so much for being here, and then again, thank you for the invitation to come speak again. I think we all know history can be very complex, a lot of different threads to follow. Trying to condense this really incredible story down into 40-45 minutes is a little challenging. So I'm going to try to cover as much as possible in what we know about the Underground Railroad here in Riley County. And of course, the Underground Railroad, that history, it hasn't been heavily documented as far as finding those primary source materials. It's always a little challenging. So I'm very grateful to those who have done the research, who have been able to uncover those primary source materials. Of course, at the time, when you're doing something illegal, you don't really want to advertise it in the local newspaper. So we're fortunate to have just great historians that have really uncovered some of this work. I will speak about a couple of them today, but I will go ahead and get started, and thank you again for being here. So most know about the Underground Railroad, but fewer know about the Underground Railroad history here, specifically in Kansas. During the territorial period, there were a number of routes through Kansas that enslaved people took to escape the bonds of slavery. But before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to remember the late, great Richard Pitts and the incredible work and care that he placed in documenting local history, most specifically, local history pertaining to the Underground Railroad. It's because of his efforts that we know more about the Underground Railroad in Wabaunsee and Riley County today. And I do believe they just had the soul food dinner. I think that was it last night or 2 nights ago? I was so disappointed I couldn't make it, but Richard was just so incredible, so warm. And I love this picture. The way he was able to talk about history with kids and children really helped, I think, them connect to those stories. So I wanted to mention Mr. Pitts, and he definitely inspired me in the field of history. So although Riley County was located, did you have an opportunity to go on his Underground Railroad tour? Yes, just great experience. Really miss him. So although Riley County was located fairly far west for a lot of Underground Railroad activity, since of course the objective was to go north to safety as soon as possible, there was still a network of safe places for those traveling through this area. So to set the stage, we're going to go back to the Kansas territorial days. On May 30th, 1854, Kansas Territory was officially established when President Franklin Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act into law. Congressional debate on the act continued discussion of whether or not slavery would be allowed to expand in the newly opened territories. The principle of popular sovereignty, some believed, offered the solution. It allowed the residents of the territory to decide through democratic process whether their state constitution would permit slavery. Kansas Territory, because of its proximity to Missouri, a slaveholding state, became a political and literal battleground for pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Contested elections, armed conflict, and recruitment of support from settlers with sympathies to the North and the South contributed to the label Bleeding Kansas. The battle for Kansas was also waged in the halls of Congress, the national press, and elsewhere in the country where people gathered to discuss or debate the issues of the day. The growing conflict was, of course, felt right here in Manhattan. Established in 1855, Manhattan and Riley County had settlers who supported slavery, such as Gardner Randolph, as well as those who supported voting Kansas into the Union as a free state, as a majority of those early settlers were free staters, such as the colony brought here by the New England Immigrant Aid Company. There were some enslaved people who lived in Kansas Territory in the 1850s. The census taken in 1854 and 55 showed 193 enslaved persons in the territory. A number of officers at Fort Riley were from the South, and some of them brought enslaved people with them to Fort Riley. During those territorial years, there were even a few slave sales. So during the territorial period, there were routes through Kansas that enslaved people took to escape slavery. A network of safe places and people who would help those escaping was established, called, as we know, the Underground Railroad. It was neither underground nor railroad, but was so called because its activities were conducted in secrecy, and because railroad terms were used in the conduct of the system. It consisted of networks of stations kept by conductors or station keepers who provided food, shelter, and wagon transportation from one station to another along the line of travel to freedom. People were hidden in secret rooms, basements, attics, barns, and other outbuildings. They were usually transported at night to avoid pro-slavery kidnappers. This system of individuals in safe houses operated east of the Missouri River until Kansas and Nebraska territories were created, as I mentioned, in 1854. And I think this is a great map here illustrating some of those routes. You can see the one that cuts through Missouri into Kansas Territory, and then of course with the ultimate mission to get up north. As previously mentioned, Riley County was fairly far west for a lot of Underground Railroad activity, since the objective was to move north as quickly as possible. So many of those escaping slavery were coming from Missouri. However, there are some instances of documented Underground Railroad history right here in Riley County. Oh, and I'm sorry, now I'm carrying around a little extra weight here. I find that I'm out of breath a little bit more, so please forgive me on that one. I didn't prepare for that. So as I mentioned, the late Richard Pitts, founder of the Wonder Workshop here in Manhattan, and Dr. Brad Bernheide, professor of secondary social studies at K-State, researched and wrote on this history. Dawn of Day, Stories from the Underground Railroad is available through the Kansas State University Department of Education website. And as Charlene, I'm glad you mentioned that too, it will also be on the Chapman, or is on the Chapman Center website. You can go there too to view this film. I did want to show just a brief segment of it, the introduction, so I'm going to pull that up here now. See if we can get this to work here.
It's a story that can't be forgotten because there's so much injustice, there's so much hatred, and it's something that we can't ever allow to happen again in our country and in the greater sense in the whole world. The best way that we can fight ignorance is to educate. And so kids need to know this story about human injustice, about doing what is right, about going and believing in something to the point where you take action on it.
Every day across the United States, school children recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The last sentence states, "with liberty and justice for all." That liberty and justice came at a price. In America, between 1607 and 1865, African Americans didn't have their freedom. During this time period, they fought to be free. However, their story has often been excluded from the American experience. Why? Because most of their stories come from the oral tradition. And until the Civil Rights era, their story wasn't considered important. African Americans, Native Americans, and Euro Americans worked together here in Kansas between 1854 and 1861 to make Kansas a free state. They established the western edge of the Underground Railroad in this country, which started the long journey to liberty and justice for all.
I am going to go ahead and stop it there, but just a little teaser. If you have not viewed this film, I highly recommend it. It's incredible. Mr. Pitts really had a way of bringing history to life, whether you're watching it in the film or if you went on his Underground Railroad tour. That's what I love. You're not just reading words on a page. He really brought the emotion and he really helped you connect to that story. So wanted to just give you that little trailer preview of it. If you have not seen it, like I said, I highly recommend it. Because it's just a fabulous piece of work there. So before we delve into the Underground Railroad involvement in Riley County, it's essential to discuss those in Waubonsee County who helped freedom seekers make their way to safety. Most accounts indicate that the Underground Railroad began running through Waubonsee in 1857 after settlers had established adequate shelter for themselves and the border war had started to quiet down. Those known to have been involved were the Bisbee family, Julius Willard, Austin and Maria Kelsey, Enoch and Sarah Platt, J.E. Platt, Charles and Maria Lines, Joshua and Mary Smith, John Smith, Samuel Weed, Amos Cottrell, Captain William Mitchell and his sister Agnes Mitchell. But specifically from that list, I wanted to point out those with Riley County connections, and that is Willard and Platt families, who both have connections here to Riley County, and those names very likely sound familiar. And I also wanted to credit to Mount Mitchell, the Prairie Guards and the park there, and what they have a beautiful comprehensive website too, documenting the Underground Railroad. So I sincerely appreciate the work that has been done with Michael Stubbs and the work that he's done to put that together. So a lot of this information is from the Mount Mitchell work. So the only structure from this period still existing is the log cabin built by Captain William Mitchell in 1856. Today it's a private residence on the Mitchell farmstead across the road from Mount Mitchell. The attic of this log cabin served as a hiding place for freedom seekers. So it was really the Mitchell homestead that was kind of the jumping off point then heading into Riley County. So one of those individuals I mentioned was Willard. Julius F. Willard, when he passed in 1917, was, quote, one of the remaining survivors of the Beecher Bible and Rifle Company, which came to Waubonsee in 1856, and last charter member alive. Julius T. Willard, his son, was a Kansas State graduate and chemistry professor, as well as the longtime college historian and vice president. Willard also served twice as the acting president of K-State in 1914 and 1918, and served as vice president from 1918 to 1935. From 1936 to 1950, Willard was the college historian for K-State, a position which led to his publishing of History of the Kansas State College of Agriculture and Applied Science in 1940. But his father here is who originally settled in Wabunsee County. And I found this newspaper article, which I thought was really interesting. You see Julius F. Willard, who was a member of the Beecher Company and one of the settlers of Wabunsee, was a pronounced Free Stater and seems to have served occasionally as a conductor on the Underground. His son, Vice President Julius T. Willard of the Kansas State College, remembered his father's telling of having accompanied 1 or 2 fugitives to a station farther north, which the son thinks may have been Manhattan, although he is not positive. Another writer suggests Louisville as a northern station to which the dusky passengers were conveyed, being 8 miles due north of Captain Mitchell's homestead. So I thought there's something, of course it's in a newspaper, but some tangible evidence. Here his son is recollecting his father's involvement as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The other name that stood out to me was Jeremiah E. Platt, who was born in 1833 in Connecticut, the 5th child of 7 children. At the age of 23, he left college and came to Kansas with 2 of his brothers to assist in the Free State cause. He preempted a claim of 160 acres 2 miles south of Wabunsee in the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony settlement. For several years, he taught school and served as the first county superintendent of Wabunsee County. In 1860, Platt was elected to the faculty of the Kansas State Agricultural College at Manhattan, where he served from 1864 to 1883. He was an important figure in the college's early development and held in high esteem by his colleagues. So he was one of the names mentioned as being involved in the Underground Railroad in that list. And of course we have Willard Hall today, named for, oh, I'm behind, I'm sorry. My goodness, I'm on the wrong side. So there's Willard there, who I mentioned earlier. There's Platt. So Platt purchased 10 acres of land not far from the college in September of 1867. The house, built in 1871, today is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is the home today of the Riley County Genealogical Society. So a piece of that history there. So even though he started out in Wabunsee, he ended up coming to Riley County, but we do have that mentioning of his involvement there in the Underground Railroad. So one of the few instances of documented history of involvement here at Riley County and in the Underground Railroad came from a gentleman named Charles Lenhart. According to an 1870 recollection by Charles Lenhart, quote, among the most conspicuous hardworking train dispatchers and other prominent officials was the Reverend Washington Marlott, whose little stone dwelling on the claim he still lives was perhaps the temporary stopping place from which many a fugitive stepped forth on his journey northward. So Lenhart arrived in Kansas around 1856 and served with John Brown. Since he was one of the, quote, best trained in the group, educationally and militarily, he was one of Brown's leading men in the Harper's Ferry raid in 1859. Lenhart returned to Kansas around 1870, and although Lenhart is buried in Paola, the family monument is in the southeast corner of the Sunset Cemetery here in Manhattan, where his wife Esther is buried. But that was so exciting when you find that he has this list of individuals that he had a recollection of their involvement here in the Underground Railroad. So one of the first individuals who was involved locally with the Underground Railroad that we will discuss today is Henry Strong. Henry Strong was born December 23rd, 1831 in Bolton, Connecticut. Henry made his first trip to Kansas in 1855 as a dedicated abolitionist with the New England Immigrant Aid Company. Hired as a freighter, Henry drove teams of oxen from Leavenworth, Kansas to Denver, Colorado, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. After passing through Manhattan, still known as New Boston just Boston at this time, Henry saw agricultural opportunity in the rich bottomland of the Blue River. He would later return to the area to settle and start a family. In 1857, Henry became a member of the First Congregational Church of Manhattan and boarded with the local family. And I love this picture. This is one of my favorite photos of early Manhattan, where you can see this is looking west on Poyntz Avenue. So the river you can see right in the front of the photograph there. Just a great image. Henry returned to Connecticut the following year to marry Eleanor Strong, his second cousin and childhood friend. Eleanor was highly educated as she attended Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts, the oldest women's college in the United States, and later attended the State Normal School in New Britain, Connecticut. A few days following the wedding, the Strongs left for Kansas Territory to establish their permanent home here in Manhattan. Upon their arrival, Henry constructed a cabin at the foot of Bluemont Hill, just west of the present-day pumping station. Henry continued to work as a freighter, and Eleanor conducted school classes in their home, becoming one of Manhattan area's first school teachers. In March of 1860, the Strongs purchased 143 acres that included a cabin, stone barn, corn crib, and other small outbuildings for $500. This land is where generations of Strongs would establish their families and livelihoods. So you can see here where that property is located on this 1881 plat map. So just right off of the river there, and where it is today. And the Strong home is still standing today. Family oral history maintains that as ardent abolitionists, Henry and Eleanora actively participated in the Underground Railroad activity through Kansas prior to and continuing on through the Civil War. With the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, freedom seekers and even free states such as Kansas could be apprehended and returned to slaveholders. Abolitionists such as Henry and Eleanora took part in the dangerous mission of escorting freedom seekers through the secretive network of attics, basements, barns, and caves, with the ultimate goal of leading them north to Nebraska and then eventually on to Canada. And this is a great map here, and this is courtesy of the Chapman Center, showing, so there was the lane trail that went up north from Topeka, but there were some difficulties with what was happening with Lawrence, Topeka, some nefarious individuals who were trying to counteract what was happening in some of those free state strongholds. So there was that spur that went further west to Manhattan and then up north. You can see through Fostoria and then on to up north to Iowa. As a secret station master, Henry would receive freedom seekers from a station east of St. George, which had been led previously by Captain William Mitchell's log cabin in Wabunsee County, which I mentioned earlier. So great photograph of this here, and as I previously mentioned, a portion of that home is still standing today, and that was one of the stops Mr. Pitt had on his Underground Railroad tour. After a night's walk, freedom seekers would be concealed by Henry and Eleanora in a small cave on the east bank of the Blue River near the Strong home until it was safe to move to the next stop. The Strong cabin, barn, and property were searched on more than one occasion. Many years later, Eleanora told her granddaughter Mabel of their involvement with the Underground Railroad. So this cave later was used to store apples and ice by the Strongs. So unfortunately, this cave has since been destroyed due to a housing project that took place in the 1960s. But just imagining, like I said, that home, well, the later home, the 1867 home, still standing today where the river was, just standing there, you can imagine what that might have been like during that time. Through the early years of the Civil War, Henry continued to work as a freighter while Eleanora maintained the farmstead. Manhattan served as a supply depot for westward bound wagon trains. In May of 1864, Henry was sworn into the Kansas State Militia at Fort Riley. They wore no uniforms, only a red badge pinned to their hats. Through his service, Henry traveled to Westport to fight off General Price's Confederates. In November of 1864, Henry mustered out and returned to Manhattan.
In the spring of 1865, Henry constructed a 2-story wooden frame house for the family on land at the foot of Bluemont Hill. In the winter 2 years after, the Strong family faced additional misfortune when a fire consumed this wood frame home and all of their possessions. Following this accident, the Strong stayed with a neighbor for many months until Henry constructed a new 2-story limestone home built with stone from the Strong quarry. The Strongs took residence in the home, located at 1916 Beck Street, in late 1867. So here's from the 1881 plat map, an illustration of the farm. They were thought to have, well, I will say, one of the largest apple orchards in Kansas, but if I had a nickel for every time reading the newspapers when somebody had the largest of something, it had quite a bit of money. But it was rumored that they had one of the largest apple orchards here in Kansas, and that was one of their primary businesses. That, of course, they would use the cave, as I mentioned, to store the apples later on. This home still stands today, as I mentioned, and has recently been purchased back into the Strong family by Rachel Ruth, great-great-great-granddaughter of Henry and Eleanora Strong. And I'm really grateful to Rachel, and if anybody knows her, extremely passionate about history. She's just wonderful. The fact that she now has this home back in her family. And she has been very generous with sharing, so her great-great-grandmother also kept diaries. So that is how we know some of this information is from what Eleanora and then Mabel, who was Eleanor's granddaughter, what they both had written in their diaries, which is just wonderful. So I believe that some of those are available online through the Riley County Historical Society and Museum. You can look those up, and but that is where this information came from. But again, this is some of the family oral history. We're thankful for those diaries that we now know more about this story and their involvement in the Underground Railroad. So the Strong family is buried just near the entrance of Sunset Cemetery, which you can see today, and there's one of their headstones there. Great view of Sunset Cemetery. You can see, here's Bluemont Hill. It looks a little different today. So moving back to the 1850s, with the opening of Kansas Territory, back in New England, the talk of the town was centered on the Kansas question. You can see in this newspaper article, what is to be the end of the Kansas question? Talking about, is Kansas going to enter the Union as a free state or a slave-holding state? A group of Massachusetts businessmen were combining their resources to help keep slavery out of the Kansas constitutions. As tension mounted across the country, Eli Thayer of Massachusetts devised a plan to prevent slavery from spreading into Kansas. He believed that if enough anti-slavery supporters settled in the territory, they could capture the vote and make Kansas a free state. 1 month before the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law, Thayer and other prestigious New England businessmen incorporated the New England Immigrant Aid Company. This company secured low-cost transportation for immigrants and provided temporary housing for settlers when they reached Kansas territory. Individuals with this group would go on to help freedom seekers make their way through Kansas on the Underground Railroad. This included Isaac and Ellen Goodnow. Ardent abolitionists Isaac and Ellen Goodnow seized the opportunity with Eli Thayer's group to head out west to Kansas. Goodnow was born in Whittingtonham, Vermont, and raised in New England. After the death of his father in 1828, Goodnow delayed his education and worked as a clerk. He eventually graduated from Wilbraham Wesleyan Academy in Wilbraham, Massachusetts in 1838. That same year, he met and married Ellen D. Dennison. In 1848, Goodnow accepted a position as a professor of natural sciences at the Providence Conference Seminary in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. He retained this position until December of 1854, when he resigned at the age of 40 with the sole purpose of moving to Kansas Territory to support the creation of a free state town by the New England Immigrant Aid Company. Goodnow had been a committed abolitionist since at least 1840. After hearing a speech given by New England Immigrant Aid Company founder Eli Thayer about the need to fight against the pro-slavery influence in Kansas Territory, Goodnow decided that he would immigrate to Kansas Territory with the company that following spring. Thereafter, he also began writing editorials and letters encouraging others to join the cause. And one of my favorite quotes from Isaac in his diary, which of course you can find, thankfully a lot of them have been transcribed through the Kansas State Historical Society. I'll tell you what, his writing got a little hard to read as he got a little older. So I'm thankful for those transcriptions. But you really get a sense of his life and his purpose. He is one of the individuals that he quit his job, packed up, and Ellen very gladly accompanied him with the sole purpose of helping Kansas become a free state. And this is one of my favorite quotes from his diary. Believing that the rule of slavery or freedom in the nation would be settled on the prairies of Kansas, I felt impelled to throw myself onto the scale on the side of freedom. I just think that's such a powerful quote from him. On March 6, 1855, Goodnoe departed Boston, Massachusetts with a group of around 75 New England immigrants. The trip required a 4-day railroad trip from Boston, Massachusetts to Illinois, then 7 to 8 day trip on a steamboat to Kansas City, then a wagon train out west to Kansas Territory. And this is a wonderful photograph. So excited to find this. This is the Kate Swinney steamboat in St. Louis, and this is 1856. Goodnoe specifically mentions in his diary that they were on the Kate Swinney steamboat. Well, you can very clearly see on top of the smokestacks there, the KS. That is the very steamboat that Isaac Goodnoe took out here to Kansas Territory. I just love, you can see the stacks of chairs, all the trunks they're bringing out with them. Just imagining packing up your life, and that was his purpose coming out here, to help Kansas become free. I just think it's a great photograph. On March 18th, Goodnoe's party reached Kansas City, where Goodnoe met with the company's representative, Samuel C. Pomeroy, and decided to form the company's new settlement at the junction of the Kansas and Blue River. Goodnoe and 6 other men traveled into Kansas Territory as an advance guard to establish the location. So here is an example of one of the pages from Isaac's diary. You can see why it's a little difficult to read. I will say, I didn't realize they weren't really teaching cursive anymore to younger kids. So, but just really great to have these resources here. So in his diary, you can see February 1855, he talks about Kansas, the all-engrossing subject. So he's still back in New England talking about Kansas is the main topic of discussion. So here's March 1855, rode 18 miles, built a fire, and dined on home cookery. And he is in Kansas now, very windy. Walked to a mound on the Blue, commanding one of the most delightful views imaginable, saw the sunset. And then the following day, very windy. Well, that was very appropriate. We can still relate to that today. Talked over matters with Reverend Mr. B relative to future duties. The responsibilities of my position almost pressed me down. Had I no one to decide for only myself, I could easily bear it. The country here is magnificent. Oh, the moonlit scenery. So the Goodnoes initially set up a small dugout cabin to serve as their residence on Wildcat Creek, which was around the area behind the Midwest Dream Car Museum today. So shortly after Kansas opened for settlement in 1854, President Franklin Pierce appointed Andrew Reeder to be the first governor of Kansas Territory. Most people believed he would support slavery in the new territory. Reeder, however, supported the concept of popular sovereignty, letting the residents of Kansas Territory decide whether or not slavery would be allowed in Kansas. Governor Reeder called for the first election shortly after he arrived in the territory, which Isaac documented in his diary, voting in that election. Election day, voted for freedom. And he does have that underlined, the word freedom underlined in his diary, with some 15 of our company. And then he goes on to mention, Missourians armed with guns, revolvers, came on and ordered us to move, compromise the matter to our satisfaction. So that following spring, pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border to vote illegally in the first territorial election held on March 30th, 1855. This resulted in what became known as the bogus legislature. Oh. So this is my favorite when you break down the numbers. You can see the total voting population, 2,905, and you see the actual number of votes cast. We have a very serious problem here in Kansas. But this also illustrates, you know what, the necessity for secrecy of individuals who are moving through Kansas on the Underground Railroad. So in this instance, as I mentioned, you had having Missourians come over here to Kansas just to vote, and of course, they're armed. Isaac Goodnow mentioned that, armed with guns and revolvers. So it was called the bogus legislature, obviously, because Free Staters believed this pro-slavery legislature was illegitimate due to widespread election fraud. The bogus legislature met in Pawnee near Fort Riley. Governor Reeder picked the town of Pawnee for several reasons. He wanted the legislature to meet far away from the influences of Missouri. Another reason was that Reeder was an investor in the city of Pawnee. So there was that. When the pro-slavery legislature arrived, the building they met in had no roof, floor, windows, or doors yet. Although some lodging was available, most legislators stayed in tents. They had to determine a permanent seat of government, create a constitution, and decide if Kansas would be a free or slave state. They met in Pawnee for only 4 days. One of its major actions was to unseat all the anti-slavery members. This, of course, angered the Free Staters. It was later reported that one anti-slavery legislator responded, quote, "Gentlemen, this is a memorable day, and may become more so. Your acts will be the means of lightning to the watchfires of our land, of war in our land." The territory gained a violent reputation. The turmoil in Kansas contributed to the growing tension between the North and South, which we know eventually led to the outbreak of the Civil War. I did want to go back to Goodnow real quickly here. So I mentioned when they came here, they lived in a small cabin behind the Midwest Dream Car Museum, that area where that's located today. So that is where it was supposed that that Underground Railroad activity took place, was in that cabin along Wildcat Creek. In 1861, they did purchase a home that we know as the Goodnow House State Historic Site today, which is still standing. So here's a photo of it in around 1880. And the beautiful Goodnow home today. Still, it's a great opportunity having the home there from 1861 to be able to tell the Goodnow story and their involvement with the Underground Railroad. So I did want to mention one more individual that we know was mentioned in recollections, especially by Charles Lenhart, of their involvement in the Underground Railroad, and that was Washington and Julia Bailey Marlott. So located at 1600 College Avenue, nestled between the Kansas State University soccer fields and the Collegiate Villa condominiums on the east side of the street, is a quaint limestone home and barn. Unless you know it's there and you're looking for it, you might miss it as you're driving by. But this home is incredibly important, as it was the home of Washington Marlott, and from the Underground Railroad period, still stands today and is listed on the Kansas Register of Historic Places. The home was built in 1856 and is the oldest stone home still standing at its original location in Manhattan. George Washington Marlott, born in Wayne County, Indiana in 1828, was the fourth in a family of 11 children. His early youth was spent on an Indiana farm and received his early education from subscription schools. At 18 years old, he was determined to secure a higher education and entered the preparatory department of Old Asbury University, now known as DePauw University today, in Indiana. He graduated in 1853, and in 1856, his alma mater conferred upon him the degree Master of Arts. In the meantime, he had united with the Methodist Episcopal Church, was licensed to preach, and pursued a course in theology. Following his graduation in 1853, he taught 1 year in Indiana. And in 1854, after returning home, Marlott spent the next 2 years farming land given to him by his father. Now, in those days, there was hardly a northern family which did not engage in discussion of the critical Kansas question. Many young men volunteering their services in a movement designed to bring Kansas in as a free state. As Kansas territory opened for settlement, Marlott, pronounced in his opposition to slavery, made the journey to help secure Kansas as a free state. In May of 1856, he arrived at Leavenworth, Kansas. From there, he proceeded on foot from Leavenworth to Manhattan to secure a claim of 160 acres. So here you can see the 1881 plat map. So this here would be Claflin Avenue, Washington Marlott farm, also had, known to have a very large apple orchard on his farm there. And then old agricultural college, so Bluemont College would have sat right there. So on this claim stood a small 1.5-story limestone home. As mentioned, this is the home that still stands today at 1600 College Avenue. Originally constructed in 1856 by Davies Wilson, a Harvard-trained engineer, it stands as one of the oldest standing stone homes today in Manhattan, as I mentioned, and in Riley County. He purchased the home and 120 acres in 1858 for $1,200, knowing that a college would soon be constructed nearby. So a view of the home today. Of course, it's had some additions on it. When the college opened with its 30 students in 1859, Marlott served as its first principal, which he was paid $600 in city lots. His assistant teacher was Miss Julia A. Bailey, brought to Kansas from Connecticut at the request of Isaac Goodnow in 1860. Marlott and Bailey would soon fall in love and marry at Bluemont Central College in 1861. The Marlott homestead became known as Bluemont Farm. After retiring from his work as a minister, Marlott became a successful farmer and stock raiser. And the Marlotts documented their family history very well. There are numerous photograph albums and diaries that you can read of the Marlotts, both Julia and Washington. Julia was also a fantastic artist too, so there are some pieces of art that she did that are at the Raleigh County Historical Museum, but great photos of their farm. So here's the Washington, great photo here underneath his windmill. I'm so sorry, my goodness, my brain. Pregnancy brain. A windmill, that word just escaped me. So the barn that Washington Marlott built beside his house, which is still standing today, was built from the stone recycled when the original Bluemont Central College building was torn down in the 1880s. Bluemont Central College, and later K-State, always accepted African American students as well as women. So you can see here, Washington Marlott is building a barn that is one of the best in the state. Over the door is the stone used in the old college, on which in deep cut letters, "He that runneth may read, Bluemont College," which is now at the Alumni Center today. It goes without saying that the Marlott family contributed greatly to the early development of Manhattan and Kansas State University, and importantly, the Underground Railroad. Washington Marlott passed in 1909, and Julia Bailey Marlott survived her husband 2 years, passing away in 1911. Both are buried in Sunset Cemetery here in Manhattan. Around our community today, we can find reminders of their influence in our community in Marlott Avenue, Marlott Park, Marlott Hall Dormitory on K-State campus, and Marlott Elementary School are all named after Marlott and both of their contributions to the establishment of the city university and what needs to be known, their involvement in the Underground Railroad. Today, the Marlott House is listed on the Register of Historic Kansas Places and serves as one of the best reminders of the heritage of the Marlott family in Riley County. So I did want to share this too, and I'm sorry, I know I'm getting a little long-winded here. This is from the Manhattan Express, September 29th, 1860. But all the efforts of the slave power were defeated by bands of immigrants from New England, from New York and other eastern states, from Germany and Ireland, who came up the Missouri River, fearless of cannons, and found the slaveholders here armed. And they drove them out of the territory and established here what is called an abolition territory, making it a place for connection by the Underground Railroad with every state. Who would have believed that this could have been done, and that we should have met here today to celebrate it with all kinds of demonstrations, by the firing of cannon, by dinners and balls, and the Union be just as safe now as it was before. So I love that passage, and I think that really summarizes just the work that was done here in Riley County, Wabunsee County, all of those surrounding ones. And I think it's interesting too, if you just look at the physical location where the Marlott homestead was, the Goodnow homestead, the Platt homestead. Obviously these individuals all work together for a common cause. And then, of course, reaching out to Wabunsee County and those connections there. I think that's what makes history just really stand out, those connections that we're able to find with our family histories. So in conclusion, although the documentation of the Underground Railroad activity is sparse, it's evident that there are those who settled here in our community who were proponents of freedom for all, and that still stands today. So that is all I have. I'm sorry, I know I went a little long, but I appreciate your time, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Do you have any questions for anybody?
I had just recently come to learn of Samuel Reader.
Yes.
My daughter is Samuel Reader. There's a Governor Reader. Was there any relationship there?
So, well, actually, same person. That should be him. Yes, if it's the one I'm thinking of, Samuel Reader, that is the same. That's Andrew, I'm sorry, is that his father? That was Andrew Reader. I definitely need to get that straightened out, but yeah. So you're reading his diary?
I just was told about it and in anticipation of it.
Okay.
We have the Kansas State Historical Society, they have it. I think that there's a few volumes missing. I don't know for sure.
Okay.
But, no, I have not yet read back and delved into it.
Okay.
But it just, I can't help but think that Samuel Reader's diary probably speaks in some part.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I don't know why that was Andrew and Sam. I'll have to figure out their connection there. I should know that, so thank you. That gives me something to get sorted out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I do.
Could somebody revive the tours?
I think that is a great suggestion. I think it needs to be done. And those of you that were on the tour with Mr. Pitts too, I mean, he just had a unique way. He was special in that he could really just, you're just captivated by every word he said, but I think that definitely could be done. And there's always more, that's, I think, with history, always more that's uncovered. As I mentioned, Rachel Ruth, there are still diaries that need to be read through. I think she has read through them, but trying to pinpoint down more of these sites, more of the history to have that tangible evidence. So I think building upon that, and I know Professor Bernheide, I think he would love to be involved in that too. So that's a great suggestion.